Alright, what's going on everyone? Since Wizards of the Coast refuses to acknowledge that Challenger decks ever existed, I've taken it upon myself to build budget versions of Tier 1 competitive decks, and today we're looking at Golgari Midrange. Now traditionally this is a very expensive deck. Most competitive lists are clocking in at a whopping $400. Some are even reaching up to $500. However, there are some very interesting things happening with this deck that makes it very possible to build on a budget without sacrificing too much power. But let's start with the obvious. We have Sheoldred. This card currently fetches $82 per copy, and depending on whether the deck plays 3 or 4 copies, it makes up $250 to $330 of the deck's cost. This is good and bad. The bad side is, well, we can't afford this, but the good part is this makes up so much of the deck's budget that just cutting this gets us very close to where we want to be. But there's also something curious that's happening with this deck, which is that it's morphing into a bit of an aggro deck. It was playing stuff like Blossoming Tortoise and Liliana of the Veil. However, since Exelons released, it gave us some aggressive creatures to add, and not only are these cheaper, but it has driven competitive players to focus more on low curve aggro threats, many of which still provide card advantage. Remember, a lot of the threats that the deck originally played were pretty aggressive and card advantage-y to begin with. So it's not that different really, it just kind of leaned into that a bit more. So while we can't play Sheoldred, it's actually surprising just how much of this deck we can play on a budget. We'll start by playing 4 Mosswood Dread Knights, 2 Glissa Sunslayers, and 3 Graveyard Trespassers. So the Dread Knight really propelled this deck to the top of the metagame when it released. It's a 2 mana 3/2 with Trample, and the adventure lets you draw a card, and the great part is you can cast the adventure the turn after the creature dies. So typically you want to play this on turn 2. A common mistake is people will play the adventure on turn 2. You want to play the creature on turn 2, get a 3-power Trampler out, put pressure on, and then when it dies, you get to just redraw and recast the creature. Glissa is a 3 mana 3/3 with First Strike and Death Touch, meaning she will kill anything in combat that doesn't have first strike before the other creature deals combat damage. And if she hits the player, you have a bunch of abilities, and once again, one of the key ones is drawing a card, just like on the Dread Knight. And then the Trespasser is more aggressive than people realize. This has been played in a lot of mid-range decks, but remember, it's a 3 mana 3/3. When it enters, it drains 1 when it exiles a creature from the graveyard, and then it does that whenever it attacks too, so it's effectively attacking for 4. It's a 3 mana, does 4 damage kind of. The life gain also helps offset the life loss from Glissa and the Dread Knight, so that's nice. So this brings our total up to $15.76. And the good news is these are some of our most expensive cards in the deck, so this number is going to go up much slower here on out. Next we'll play 3 Cult Conscripts and 4 Tenacious Underdog. These continue the theme of aggressive threats that generate card advantage. The Conscripts is a 1 mana 2/1, very aggressive, and you can return them to the battlefield whenever a non-skeleton dies, so that's nice. And the Underdog is a 2 mana 3/2, once again, aggressive body, and it can be blitzed from the graveyard, and when you do that, you draw a card when it's sacrificed. And it should be noted that Cult Conscripts aren't typically played. This is our budget concession for Sheoldred. If you happen to own any of those, you want to cut Cult Conscripts for Sheoldred. She's obviously much better. She's also actually pretty aggressive. She's a 4 mana 4-power creature that makes the opponent lose 2 every turn. So Sheoldred's great, but it's very expensive. So we'll be paying 30 cents for our skeletons here. And yeah, add any Sheoldreds that you happen to have if you so wish. And both of these are very low budget, so they bring our total to just $17.46. Moving on to the Exelons additions to the deck. These are all brand new, at least when I'm recording this. We have 4 Deep Cavern Bats, 2 Preacher of the Schism, and 3 Sentinels of the Nameless City. The first is our least aggressive creature. It's a 2 mana 1/1, but it does have flying, and most importantly, it looks at the opponent's hand and pulls a card out until the bat dies. It's ironic this is an Exelons because it's very similar to Kitesail Freebooter, which was also played in a lot of aggro decks. The Vampire is a 3 mana 2/4, but when it attacks, if your opponent has the most life, you get an extra 1/1, and if you have the most life, you lose 1 and draw a card. So it makes tokens when you're behind, and it trades life for cards when you're ahead. And do note that if you're just tied with your opponent in terms of life, you will actually get both of those effects. And then the Sentinel is a 3 mana 3/4, so very solid, and it makes map tokens. So these are a great mana sink in the late game. They offer some card draw or some card filtering, stuff like that. And yeah, this brings our total up to just $23.30. Next, we'll be playing 2 copies of Ashiok Wicked Manipulator. So the deck plays a couple different planeswalkers. Traditionally, it was Liliana of the Veil, but Nissa Ascended Animist has become popular recently. Both of these are great, but they're a little bit expensive, so on a budget, we'll be playing Ashiok, as they're just 50 cents each, 55 cents technically. It's just nice having some top-end planeswalkers that can help close out the game. And while this is a fairly aggressive deck, as we've seen, we have a ton of ways to draw cards, so getting to 5 mana isn't that difficult, and this brings our total up to $24.40. Next, we have the removal with 3 copies of Cut Down, 3 Go for the Throat, and 1 Gix's Command. The first kills small creatures in the early game. Go for the Throat can hit anything if it's not an artifact, and Gix's Command has a lot of versatility. It can act as a board sweeper for small creatures. It can force opponents to sacrifice their biggest creature. It can add counters to a creature and give it lifelink against aggro decks, and it can return creatures from the graveyard to your hand. And keep in mind you get to choose 2 of those, so a lot of useful abilities for a variety of decks. The removal package brings our total to $29.47, which is pretty much right on the money for a challenger deck. So I hope this shows how cheap the main board of this deck can be. It's going to get a little bit more expensive. We still have the mana base and the sideboard, but $30 for a deck that, is reaching upwards of 400 to 500 is pretty solid, just because we don't have $300 of Shieldred, right? Obviously, she's amazing, very powerful card, but without it, we can get this going for very cheap. So moving on to the mana base, we'll play 4 Llanowar Waste, 2 Mishra's Foundry, and 2 Restless Cottage. And I will say that the Foundry is very optional, just because we don't have all the dual lands we need, and playing a colorless land like this is maybe a little bit risky. So consider that optional, but the first is a pain land. Unfortunately, the Golgari one is fairly cheap. I like to show the most recent printing as the image, but the price is always from the cheapest version, and in this case, it is the M15 edition. The pain lands have been printed tons of times, and you can find older editions of this for very cheap. The Foundry can animate into a creature, which is very useful against decks with board sweepers, because they wipe the board and then you have an attacker still. Although, as I said, the colorless land is a little risky, and the Cottage is a dual land. It animates into a 4/4, though do note it enters tapped, so I do see a lot of decks playing 4 of these, but I think it's a little bit excessive, just because even though we're a mid-range deck, we do still like to put pressure on and play our stuff on curve, and having a land enter tapped on turns like 1, 2, and 3 can feel pretty bad. I personally would play 2 to 3, but some decks do play 4, and that's definitely an option. That's what most people do, and that's totally fine if you want to go for that. And the rest of our mana base will be basics, unfortunately. It's a little bit clunky with as many basics, but it's just necessary on a budget. So our mana base is $11.92, a little high, but not terrible, and you could cut it down to $8 if you skip those foundries. But our new total is $41.39. And briefly going over the sideboard, we have 1 each of Cut Down, Go for the Throat, and Parasitic Grasp. This is so we can adjust the ratios of our removal depending on what we're matched up against. We also have 2 The End for Duress and 2 Path of Peril. The End blows up a creature and then finds all other copies of it, which is great for things like Atraxa and Atali, or just any sort of combo deck that needs a specific creature. Duress is great against combo and Azorius control decks. Being able to pull out counter spells is very nice. Path of Peril is a board wipe for aggro decks. We're never going to cast it for the cleave cost. It's just a 3 mana board wipe for aggro. We also have an extra Gix's Command, which can come in when one of these abilities is particularly relevant. And on a budget, we are playing 3 Outland Liberators. So these are typically Tranquil Throwbacks, which are about $4 each, so that's $8 total. Not only can they blow up artifacts and enchantments like the Liberator, but it has life gain, which is good for red aggro and Azorius soldiers and stuff, and it can exile graveyards for like the Rakdos Reanimator decks. So most decks play 2 copies of the Throwback, but that's because they also play one copy of Boseiju in the mana base, so this is obviously very expensive. So in our case, we're going to play 3 Liberators, and I do want to note that there are alternatives. You could play things like Cankerbloom and Thrashing Brontodon. All of these are great. The reason I like the Liberator is it can flip into Frenzied Trapbreaker, at which point it blows up an artifact or enchantment every time it attacks, which makes it terrifying, like against Selesnya enchantments, for example. But the Cankerbloom and Thrashing Brontodon are fine, and if you have any Tranquil throwbacks, those are what are typically played, just because it has more versatility. It can be brought in against more decks. So anyway, our sideboard is just $5, and our total deck price is $46.42. While it might not be perfect, I do think it's a very, very solid deck for the price. We're like 90% of a Golgari Midrange deck. Missing out on Shieldred is pretty crazy, but tier 1 decks are literally, not even exaggerating, 10 times this, right? We're at $46. Tier 1 decks are $460, right? They're $400 to $500. So we're 1/10 of the price, and we have like 95% of the deck, and I think it'll still win a lot of games. So yeah, that's the deck. If you want to see more budget guides like this, I have a playlist dedicated to these budget deck guides, and you can find a link to it in the description below. And in the meantime, thanks for watching. I hope this was useful, and I will see you in the next one.